everybody. The recent Ebola outbreak in West Africa just seems to be spiraling out of control, and this, of course, is creating a lot of concern around the world. How far can this virus go? So joining us today is Professor Robert Dingwall. He's an expert in infectious diseases policy at Nottingham Trent University in England. Thank you for joining us today, Professor. Have a good afternoon.
And good afternoon to you.
Well, thank you for being here today. Professor, I wanted to ask you, my first question is related to what everyone around the world is saying. I'm afraid there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of concern because people think or feel that the Ebola virus has the potential to, reach the status of global pandemic. How real is this? Is this something that could really happen?
Well, it's extremely unlikely unless we see a mutation in the virus itself. Unlike something like influenza, it's actually not very contagious unless you're in very close contact with it. And that makes it very difficult for it to spread globally.
So let's say that if you're riding a bus with someone who has the virus, there is no risk of becoming infected unless you're in contact with the person's bodily fluids. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. I mean, clearly, if the person starts vomiting or bleeding, and you don't know what's sort of going on, then there would be a risk in those circumstances. On the other hand, the nature of the disease is such that by the time you start shedding body fluids, you're pretty sick anyway, and you're fairly unlikely to be riding on a bus.
My question about this is because people say that clearly the fact that now at least this outbreak is out of control suggests that this could spread to other countries. But what I wanted to ask you, and I'm pretty sure you know this, is what is exactly the reason why this outbreak is so out of control? Is it because of the virus that is very strong, or because of poor medical infrastructure in the countries where this outbreak is taking place?
Well, it's a combination of poor medical infrastructure and weak states, weak governments. I mean, most of the cases that have occurred in this and previous outbreaks have occurred in relatively remote parts of Africa. The reservoir of the virus appears to be some mammal that lives in jungles, possibly fruit bats. And you've got...
People eat the fruit bats, right?
Sorry?
They eat the fruit bats. It's kind of a delicacy there.
Yes. Well, if you're in a remote village, it's not like Argentina. You haven't got sort of lots of steak wandering around. You eat whatever meat you can lay your hands on. So you've got this... most of the outbreaks are happening in these relatively remote areas where the health infrastructure is very limited, the government infrastructure is very limited. To the extent that they're moving into more densely populated urban areas, they're going into slum housing, the sort of the kind of thing you would recognize, I think, as a favela in South America. Sure. Again, where the health infrastructure is quite limited, and so is the government infrastructure. So it's very difficult to get a control on the population. Right. And the experience that we're seeing in West Africa is not really a very good model for what would happen if we got cases occurring in a developed country with a stronger state and stronger public health structures.
Right, so it's something like that happened. If there was someone who got infected here in Argentina, someone who came from West Africa and started showing symptoms, it would be rather easily to contain, right?
It would depend on where they were traveling to, I imagine. I mean, I've never been to Argentina. I understand that there are sort of relatively remote parts up towards the Andes or the Brazilian border.
Right, but the medical structure here is... It's a lot better. Like it's a really good structure. So I assume that if something like that came to pass, the person infected would be isolated immediately, and no other people would be infected. At least that's according to what I've been reading, and comparing it to the reality of countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, or Guinea, where most of the outbreaks remain out of control.
Yes, I mean, if this was something that happened in Buenos Aires, for example, I would imagine that the authorities would fairly quickly get a grip on it. I'm not saying that you couldn't have one or two cases passed on. You have to be pretty strict with the infection control among the health workers. But in general, I think the risk in a well-organized country like Argentina would be pretty minimal.
Right. Now, I read that countries like Liberia, for example, rely heavily on outside help because there are just no doctors there. I've been reading that the World Health Organization has pledged $100 million in order to help and see if they can if they can get the situation under control. The United States is also increasing financial aid. There are more health workers that are trying to reach the area in order to help. Do you think this is going to bring any results?
Well, ultimately, this is the only way that we are going to get results. I mean, left untreated, the outbreak would burn itself out in certainly in these rural areas with quite a significant level of mortality. But clearly, if it takes hold in these sort of disorganized shanty towns around the major cities, then it does become a much more serious threat, and it's worth investing to stop that. But I mean, there's every reason to think that this virus and the rural populations in at least the jungle regions of Africa have coexisted for a very long time. And the difficulty of transmission means, I suspect, that the outbreaks do burn themselves out eventually. But they, under modern conditions, that still constitutes a risk that we probably wouldn't want to take.
Right. Well, final question, Professor, and this is, I could be wrong, but there have only been, in this outbreak, over 700 people have died so far.
Yes.
And why do you think that this gets so much attention on an international scale? Because if you compare it with other diseases, I think that what people really fear is that the way that people die from the Ebola virus is very gruesome. It's a terrible disease, that's clear. But why do you think that there's so much paranoia right now around the world?
Well, I mean, as you say, it is a terrible thing to die of. It's not a nice way to go at all. But I think some of it is just the number of unknowns about this disease.
Right.
We don't really know which animals harbor it. We don't know how it moves between animals and humans. Viruses are fairly mysterious things at the best of times, and we don't have good treatments for viral diseases generally. So there are a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainties, and that perhaps makes it a bit more scary than diseases that we better understand, or even things like wars, where we may have some idea about who's causing it and how we would stop it. There's a lot more uncertainty about this kind of disease, and that just makes it a bit more frightening.
Right. Well, so in case that if someone believes they're infected, you suggest that they go to the nearest hospital and that they seek isolation right away. I'm saying this because I know that some of the symptoms bear some similarities with other diseases such as cholera or malaria. So those are diseases, especially cholera is a disease that there are sometimes cholera outbreaks here in South America. So it's always good to keep in mind that if someone has any of those symptoms, it would be wise, especially if they've been to West Africa or have been in contact with anyone who's been to West Africa, it would be wise to go to the closest hospital and seek at least to get some testing and just isolation just in case. Professor Dingwall, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us today. And if hopefully this outbreak will be contained soon. If not, we'll try to talk to you again for some updates. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Fine.
Have a good day.